she suddenly opened her eyes, rose quickly, and went to the window, and after confirming that her mother-in-law had already gone downstairs and left the house, she immediately sat down at the piano, then slipped into the beautiful sound of the music. She did this because her mother-in-law was always cold and harsh toward her and constantly made things difficult for her love of playing the piano, so she could only enjoy the joy the piano brought her every day while her mother-in-law was out. But before she could finish the piece, her mother-in-law suddenly returned, and with no other choice, Lucile slowly closed the piano. To stop Lucile from secretly playing again, her mother-in-law directly locked the piano. Hearing the sound of the key turning, Lucile fell completely into despair. Half a year earlier, under her father's arrangement, Lucile had come to her mother-in-law's home and become her daughter-in-law. Soon after, war broke out, and her husband who had joined the army went missing on the front lines. Although her mother-in-law's family was wealthy and lived without worry, Lucile was not happy at all, because in her mother-in-law's eyes, she was a scheming woman who married into the family for its fortune. For the 6 months after the wedding, her husband treated her with indifference. That day her mother-in-law took her to a farmer's home in the countryside to collect rent from the fields, and she repeatedly warned her not to make a sound when they arrived. Her mother-in-law had deliberately come at mealtime intending to make a surprise inspection to see what the farmer's daily life was really like, because her mother-in-law was planning to raise the rent. But since the piano had been locked and she was in a cold war with her mother-in-law, Lucile deliberately slammed the car door loudly. Her furious mother-in-law immediately turned around and shot Lucile a fierce glare, and hearing the noise, the farmer instantly hid all the meat on the table, and in the end her mother-in-law's plan to raise the rent failed. Then her mother-in-law led Lucile toward another farmer's home, and along the way they encountered many people displaced by the war. At this time, France's capital Paris had just fallen under the fierce attack of the German forces. The Allied armies of Britain and France were nearly defeated, and large numbers of French civilians were fleeing south to escape the war. The already narrow road was packed with people, and their car could not move normally in the crowd. Her mother-in-law told Lucile to get out of the car to check the road, but just as she stepped down, an elderly man with white hair begged them, saying that he and his wife were exhausted from fleeing and asking if his sick and weak wife could rest in Lucile's car for a moment. Kind-hearted Lucile immediately agreed to the man's request. Just then, they heard the roaring engines of aircraft. Fixing her eyes on the distance, she saw several German aircraft rapidly closing in on a speeding train, and in the next instant the planes dropped a bomb. Just as people were thrown into panic, 3 more German aircraft changed direction and flew quickly toward the crowded path filled with refugees. The terrified crowd scattered at once, and what followed was a thunderous and devastating round of bombing. After the planes left, the small path was already a scene of ruin, and cries of pain and terrified screams echoed without end like a vision of torment. This was Lucile's first time experiencing war firsthand, and she looked around in fear, her heart in chaos, her face pale, and her mind overwhelmed. Just as she stood there in confusion, she suddenly saw her mother-in-law waving to her from not far away, and Lucile immediately ran toward her as fast as she could. She rushed into the car, and her mother-in-law drove straight through the fields to avoid the fleeing crowds and escape quickly. When they returned to the town, they found it already overflowing with people who had fled from elsewhere, and only at this moment did Lucile begin to understand the true cruelty of war. Although she had known before that war was harsh, only by experiencing it herself and being in the middle of it could she understand what cruelty truly meant. Just then, she heard the roaring engines of an aircraft again. After the bombing she had just endured, that roaring sound felt like a sign of death arriving on Earth, and she immediately crouched down in panic trying to hide. But the aircraft merely roared past overhead. The people experiencing war for the first time watched the plane leave in confusion, unaware that it was only a harmless reconnaissance aircraft. After the plane departed, a wave of leaflets drifted down like falling snow. The leaflets claimed that the Allied forces had abandoned them and that the German troops who had come from afar were their saviors. A few days later, Lucile heard on the radio that the French government had surrendered. Upon hearing the news, her mother-in-law was instantly thrown into panic, because her family possessed great wealth and she feared that once the German forces arrived, everything she had might no longer belong to her. Facing such a desperate moment, helpless townspeople crowded into the church seeking a bit of comfort. Even the respected priest could do nothing under such circumstances, and he could only repeat words meant to soothe their hearts. He told them that darkness was temporary and that light would one day shine again on the land where they had lived for generations. He urged people to learn patience and to learn to wait. He also told them that in such a dangerous moment, they should help one another and unite as one to face the unknown fate approaching them. At that moment, the sound of car engines and the steady rhythm of marching boots came from outside the church. and the priest hurried to lead the people in one final sincere prayer. When Lucile followed the crowd out of the church, she saw large numbers of German troops marching neatly into the town. Soon the German forces began announcing new rules of control. Facing the sudden arrival of the occupiers, the panicked Lucile instinctively hid behind her mother-in-law. As the German officer announced the new regulations, a soldier even adjusted the clock in the town square to Berlin time. Finally, the officer declared that all weapons must be handed in before noon the next day. Otherwise, anyone found with weapons would be executed on the spot. After the occupiers finished their announcement, the townspeople lowered their heads and left in silence. Lucile and her mother-in-law had barely returned home when a German officer suddenly arrived. It turned out that several German officers were being assigned to stay in the homes of the town's residents. Because Lucile's mother-in-law was wealthy and her home well-equipped, it naturally became the army's first choice. This was the first time Lucile had been so close to an occupying officer. Except this officer did not seem as harsh or overbearing as she had imagined. The German lieutenant carried himself with a certain calm politeness, and he spoke gently to reassure them not to be afraid while promising he would not disrupt their lives. He said he only needed a room to rest in and a desk to work at. But faced with the sudden arrival of the occupier, the family simply stood in silence without saying a word. The lieutenant walked straight to the clock and changed the time to Berlin time. He explained to everyone, saying, "I know this is impolite, but our rules about time are very strict, and I hope you can understand." Seeing that no one responded, the lieutenant had no choice but to walk directly into a room. Lucile's husband was a French soldier resisting the German advance. Although France had already surrendered, there was still no news of her husband, and whether he was alive or not remained unknown. That night she and her mother-in-law waited for the German lieutenant to join them for dinner while praying for the safe return of her husband who was resisting the invaders. But the lieutenant did not stay for dinner and instead politely asked her mother-in-law for the key to the piano. Hearing this, Lucile immediately turned her head and looked at the lieutenant. Her mother-in-law had locked the piano only because she disliked Lucile playing it. But now, even though she was deeply unwilling, she had no power to resist the occupier and could only hand over the piano key. Lucile assumed the lieutenant would play some kind of militaristic song, but instead she suddenly heard a melody as beautiful as a voice from the heavens. The soft and graceful notes instantly drew in Lucile, who also loved the piano. The next morning Lucile brought her husband's hunting rifle to the square. Preparing to hand it over, there she unexpectedly saw posters put up by the soldiers spreading messages against the Jewish community. Besides that, notices had been posted announcing that residents must use German currency in daily trade, that no one could go out after 9 at night, and that no one could leave the town without a permit. Faced with this series of restrictive rules, the townspeople were full of complaints, but powerless as they were, they could only accept them in silence. The sudden appearance of many young soldiers in town stirred excitement in girls who had lost their husbands or could not find a partner. Their parents had to try everything to keep them away. On her way back from the market, Lucile unexpectedly ran into the lieutenant again, and he offered to help carry her things. But Lucile, who deeply resented the occupiers, ignored him. She gradually noticed that the lieutenant staying in her home played a beautiful piano piece every night, a piece she had never heard before. Although she felt strong resistance toward this man who represented the occupying force, her love for piano always drew her back to his music. One day she visited a friend and mentioned her husband who had put on a uniform to resist the invasion but had since disappeared without a trace. Following her friend's advice, she decided to write him a letter, although she had no idea where he was or whether he was alive. Her friend told her that writing to him was something she should do as his wife. That afternoon Lucile picked up her pen to write, but no matter how hard she tried, she didn't know what to say. She had been married to him for less than 3 months before he enlisted and left her. In her heart her husband felt almost like a stranger she had only just met. She barely managed to write a few words before she found herself unable to continue. Just then a dog suddenly rushed out and completely interrupted her thoughts. And the dog's owner was the lieutenant who lived in Lucile's home and played the piano every night. He started making casual conversation with her, but as always Lucile ignored him. Yet the lieutenant did not give up and kept trying to find something to talk about, until he asked a question. When the subject turned to the piano she loved most, Lucile finally opened her mouth to speak. For the first time in months she spoke to the lieutenant. She told him that the piano had been part of her dowry, but because her mother-in-law disliked her playing, she always kept it locked. And, being a lover of music, Lucile asked him the name of the piano piece he often played at night, because she had never heard it before. It turned out that before the war the lieutenant had been a composer, and the piece Lucile had never heard was his own creation. He had intended to compose the piece as a gift for his wife, but before he could finish it, she had left him and married someone else. The two of them talked back and forth like old friends who had known each other for years. Their shared love of music instantly bridged the distance between them, and all of this was witnessed by Lucile's mother-in-law. She angrily scolded Lucile, saying she should not talk to the lieutenant. She told her, "My son, your husband, is missing and may be lost because of the soldiers. Every one of them is our enemy." She ordered Lucile to keep her distance from the lieutenant. Lucile understood all of this in her heart, and she knew very well that to her the lieutenant was still an occupier, yet the piece he had composed always somehow captivated her. One day Lucile noticed that the lieutenant's room was not closed, and driven by curiosity, she slowly walked inside. There she saw the sheet music of the very piece he always played resting on his desk. The moment Lucile picked it up, the beautiful melody seemed to sweep over her. Just as she was absorbed in it, the lieutenant suddenly returned, and startled, he hurried to set the sheet music down. Clearly flustered, he immediately became alert, grabbed the documents on his desk, and demanded to know whether Lucile had looked at them. Lucile rushed to explain that she had only just come in and had not touched anything, but in the next moment, the lieutenant handed her the papers and asked her to read them. With no choice, Lucile slowly took the documents and began to read. It turned out they were not secret military files at all but letters from neighbors complaining to the lieutenant. Because her mother-in-law's family was wealthy and often acted arrogant and superior, the neighbors had all secretly written letters accusing and insulting them. Lucile never imagined that the neighbors who always greeted them so politely could actually do such a thing. She hurried to explain to the lieutenant that all of this was slander, but he said nothing and simply asked Lucile to leave the room. Then one night he burned all the letters to ashes. The perceptive lieutenant also realized that Lucile had probably entered his room, not for the documents but to look for the sheet music of the piece he was composing. So that night he handed Lucile a small box. After hesitating several times, Lucile finally opened the box slowly and found a short section of sheet music inside, and as she looked at the music he had given her, she fell into deep thought. The next morning, after the lieutenant left and her mother-in-law also went out, Lucile quickly went through the pockets of his clothes, found the piano key, and once again slowly opened the instrument. After more than 3 months, she finally sat down and played with all her heart again, but the sharp-eyed lieutenant had not truly left. He was standing outside the window, secretly enjoying the captivating melody Lucile was playing. However, not every officer staying in local homes was as courteous and refined as the lieutenant. One night her friend's husband suddenly came to see Lucile, and he told her that the officer living in their house was constantly harassing his wife. Although the man had once fallen from a horse and broken his leg, he was still full of courage. Driven to the edge, he secretly took his hunting rifle and planned to shoot the officer while he was bathing by the river, but in the end he decided to deal with it in a more rational way. So he came directly to Lucile's home instead. Because the lieutenant living with Lucile was that officer's superior, he hoped Lucile could help and asked the lieutenant to restrain his subordinate. Yet Lucile's mother-in-law deeply hated the soldiers and had repeatedly forbidden Lucile from speaking with the lieutenant, insisting she keep her distance at all times. Caught in this dilemma, Lucile finally chose to go against her mother-in-law's wishes in order to help her friend, and she brought the husband to see the lieutenant. But the lieutenant said that the man he wanted to complain about now held the same rank as he did and that he no longer had the authority to order him around. Anxious and afraid, Lucile quietly begged the lieutenant to help. After thinking for a few seconds, the lieutenant finally agreed to try. After the man left, the lieutenant told Lucile that he had agreed to help only because of her. In return, he said he hoped she would stop treating him so coldly, that since he was living in their house he wanted to become their friend. At first Lucile both feared and hated the lieutenant, because in her mind he was part of the occupying force, but after observing him for more than 3 months, she found that he behaved with dignity, spoke kindly, and had been a composer before the war, and their shared love of music gradually erased the barrier of his identity in her heart. In the end, Lucile agreed that when her mother-in-law was not at home, she would treat the lieutenant as a friend. After that, whenever her mother-in-law was out, the two would often gather to talk about anything and everything, especially music. Sometimes, on a sudden impulse, they would even hold each other and dance. As they spent more and more time together, a special kind of affection quietly grew between them. Lucile suddenly realized that she had fallen in love with a man who was part of the force occupying her homeland, and this man also began to pursue her with growing passion. But at the crucial moment she forced herself to stand up and walk away. She kept reminding herself that he was part of the army that had taken their land and harmed her people, yet the feelings growing inside her kept surging back again and again. Her eyes would always, without meaning to, linger on the lieutenant, and she spent her days in agonizing conflict with herself. Until one day, the lieutenant, who was just as deeply in love, finally took the first decisive step. That kiss completely pulled Lucile out of the struggle she had been trapped in for days. From then on, she often met the lieutenant in secret whenever her mother-in-law was not at home. Lucile told herself that no matter how the war raged outside, no matter how others fought and bled, she only wanted to be with the man she loved. She thought she could go on like this, secretly happy with the lieutenant, but she never expected that the hunting rifle her friend's husband had hidden in the barn would be discovered by the officers staying in their house. According to army regulations, anyone who hid a weapon would be executed. The officer, who had long been coveting the man's wife, even arrogantly said that once the husband was gone, he would take good care of her. Hearing this, the anger that the man had buried deep inside him suddenly exploded. He leaped up and knocked the officer to the ground. In the struggle, the officer pulled out the pistol at his waist, but after a desperate fight, the husband managed to shoot him. However, the gunshot was heard by nearby soldiers on patrol. Several soldiers immediately ran toward the sound, firing as they went. Seizing his chance, the man jumped onto the officer's motorcycle and sped away. Seeing her husband being chased, his wife rushed forward to try to stop the soldiers. In the end, thanks to sheer luck, the man managed to escape. At that very moment, Lucile was still lost in the secret happiness of her affair with the lieutenant. She had dressed carefully, lit candles, and was planning to spend a sweet evening alone with him while her mother-in-law was out. But unexpectedly, her friend suddenly arrived and tearfully told Lucile everything that had just happened to her husband. She loved her husband deeply and could not bear the thought of him being executed by the soldiers, and she had seen that the officer leading the hunt was the very man Lucile was involved with. She begged Lucile to help save him. In that moment, Lucile suddenly realized that her own people were being humiliated and hunted, and she herself was still drowning in a so-called love with an officer from the occupying force. She suddenly felt ashamed and selfish. Furious, she reached out and pinched out the flame of the candle she had just lit. The next morning, at the town square, the soldiers announced that one of their officers had been killed by a local resident and that the killer was still at large. They declared that anyone who knew anything and stayed silent, or hid and helped the fugitive, would be treated as an accomplice. Lucile stood in the crowd, looking at the lieutenant among the soldiers opposite her, and he saw her as well. Their eyes met, and in that instant Lucile became completely clear-headed and realized that she and the lieutenant could never truly be together. The lieutenant was then called into the office by his superior, and Lucile slowly turned away and walked off, as if silently saying goodbye to him. He never imagined that the fugitive he was searching for was actually hiding in the very house where he lived. Just a few hours earlier, he had led his men in a thorough search of the entire town, turning everything upside down, yet finding no trace of the man. And while he was out leading the search, Lucile had secretly hidden the fugitive in her own home. As the search grew more intense, Lucile worried that the man hiding in their barn would eventually be discovered. With no other option, she told her mother-in-law the whole story. Although her mother-in-law was usually proud and stubborn, the moment she learned that the man was being hunted because he had killed an officer, her hatred of the occupiers flared, and she happily led him to a hidden compartment behind a wardrobe on the third floor. Soon after, a unit of soldiers arrived at their house, although they had been thorough and relentless elsewhere. Here, because it was their officer's residence, the soldiers only conducted a quick search and then reported that they had found nothing. Their commanding lieutenant would never have guessed that the woman he loved had hidden the very fugitive he was hunting in his own lodgings. Because they could not catch the man who had killed the officer, the soldiers decided to grab someone else to take the blame. They chose the town's mayor. The priest gave the mayor a final prayer and then embraced him in a long farewell. Then, at the lieutenant's command, the soldiers raised their rifles. The lieutenant's lover Lucile saw everything, from the way he had ordered searches that turned the town upside down to the way the mayor was taken to die in another man's place. Lucile had once believed she could ignore politics and war and stay with the lieutenant no matter what, but what the soldiers did in the town filled her with grief and anger. She still loved him, but she knew that this love could only be buried deep in her heart, because in truth, they were two people destined to stand on opposite sides. After they survived the major search, Lucile decided to help the man leave town to prevent further danger. To get a permit, she went to the army office building to see the lieutenant. She told him she needed to travel outside town to buy medicine for a friend's daughter and asked for a pass. But the lieutenant said that his orderly came from a family that ran a tobacco business and was very familiar with different smells of smoke. During the search that afternoon, The orderly had noticed a different kind of tobacco in Lucile's house. This meant that there might be another man hiding there and that he could be the fugitive they were trying to find. Between his duty as an officer and his feelings for Lucile, the lieutenant was torn. This was why he had been drinking alone, and now Lucile was asking him for a pass, which almost confirmed his suspicions. Yet in the end he still agreed to prepare the pass for her. The next day Lucile hid the man in the car's trunk, then drove herself and used the pass to take him safely out of town. At the same time, the lieutenant received orders to move his unit and leave the town. When Lucile returned and saw that his room was already empty, a wave of helpless sadness washed over her. The piano piece that the lieutenant had been working on all this time was finally finished. He left the sheet music behind for Lucile, and as she looked at it, her eyes filled with tears. That piano piece carried almost all of their shared memories of love, but in such a chaotic time of war, their story had been doomed to a bleak ending from the very beginning. I am a film lover. Welcome to subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.